Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 321. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And I'm back again with returning champion to the podcast and BJJ Mental Models sponsored athlete. I've got Mr. Chris Wojcik. Chris, my friend, how is it going?
It's going really good, Steve. I'm glad to be back. This is, like I've said it every time I'm on this podcast, but BJJ Mental Models was long before you sponsored me. It was my favorite jiu-jitsu podcast. So it is always a treat and always a pleasure to be on this podcast. So I'm really happy to be here and, been really busy lately. So things have been good.
Man, I can imagine talking about really busy. I don't think you've been on the podcast since your big ADCC performance in 2024. Am I right? Or were you on since then?
No, I was on. I talked to your brother since then, but I think the last time I talked to you was right before that whole thing happened. We talked about, what did we talk about? Did we talk about leg locks or did we talk about guard strategy? I remember now. I have a picture here, episode 288.
There you go. Amazing, man. Well, I am certainly glad to have you back here. I mean, everyone last year was talking about Chris Wojcik, the dark horse of ADCC. Everyone was so amazed by your performance. And, to quote Nick Diaz, I ain't surprised, mofos. I fully expected you were going to put on an amazing show. I mean, you came in there, you got that opportunity, and your performance was incredible. And I think a big part of this actually informs the technical topic we're going to discuss here today. But any thoughts you want to share on that experience, just about what you learned, how it went? So before we dig into the details of the conversation today, I'd love to get your thoughts there.
Yeah, ADCC was just a different kind of competition experience because it was literally like normally every competition you go into and you think, oh, there's the next one, whatever. We'll just, it's all a learning experience. And ADCC was kind of the first one where it was like, no, this is not really just a learning experience. This is kind of like the biggest tournament of your life. So you should act like it. And so I kind of training was way different. And then of course I had injuries throughout the entire training camp and different kind of things that I was dealing with. So just a really stressful and exciting few months, and in hindsight, definitely one of the most fun, exciting jiu-jitsu competitions I've ever been a part of. It was a ton of fun, super exciting.
Awesome. Well, I am glad to hear that you were doing great, man. Now today, something I want to talk to you about, some bullshit that you created. Let's talk about this thing. Let's talk about the Woj lock. Now, of course, we have the advantage/disadvantage of doing this through audio. Right? The benefit to anything with the visual element is we can just show people what we're talking about. The downside to audio is we can't do that, but the upside is we can talk about concepts. So I think we're going to have to probably steer this conversation kind of carefully because I understand that people can't see what we're talking about. And if they've never trained the Woj lock before, then they might not be super familiar. So I will turn it over to you first. Maybe talk a little bit about what this submission is, and if there's a way that you can kind of broadly explain it verbally so that people better understand it, let's talk about it. Because I really think after doing some rounds of this with my brother that this is going to be a technique that we see a lot more of in 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, so first of all, I hate to destroy my own lore here, but I didn't invent the Woj lock. I kind of discovered it. I started doing it back at purple belt, I think. as a like Aoki lock with but essentially what the Woj lock is a reverse Aoki lock. So generally you're going to do it from 50-50 where your partner's leg is across your center line. So 50-50. Some people have had success with it from cross ashi or saddle or, honey hole, whatever you want to call it, from there as well. I generally, every time I've hit it in competition, I've hit it from 50-50. I haven't seen anybody hit it in comp from saddle yet. So the jury's kind of still out on whether that is going to be effective at the highest levels. But the reverse Aoki, now known as the Woj lock, is essentially an inverted Aoki lock when your partner's leg is across your body and you can expose the heel onto your chest just like an Aoki lock and apply the opposite kind of pressure that you would apply. So for an traditional Aoki lock, you rotate externally. For a reverse Aoki lock, you rotate internally. And so it's an inverted Aoki lock. I started doing it at brown belt or purple belt because I would compete against, they would just stall in the gi. And like they would put me in 50-50 and hold me there for like a long time. And I couldn't figure out how to get out. So I was like, maybe I can figure out a way to break somebody's leg from here. That ended up becoming the reverse Aoki lock. And the first one that I hit in competition, I started using it in training at purple belt, early brown belt. And then I really got into leg locks at brown belt. And the first time I hit it in competition was actually against another guy who had a really big breakout performance in August against a guy named Lucas Cainard, who's from Australia. He's got very good barambolos, very good crab ride. And he literally almost baramboloed me, and I just countered the barambolo and got the reverse Aoki, and, I got the footlock. And that was the first one that I ever hit. And then ever since then, it's just kind of become a regular part of my 50-50 game, like for years. And then as I kind of started getting some recognition on the comp scene, I getting to do ADCC. I used this technique at ADCC. When I did PGF this fall, I used it quite a bit. And then what really, it's funny, hitting it in competition is, good for validity. But the best thing for branding was that somebody called it the Woj lock and put a video on YouTube, and that kind of created the whole Woj lock madness. So shout out to Kieran Kachuk, one of your fellow countrymen who named it the Woj lock, and that kind of took it to the next level.
Amazing, man. Well, I'll try to explain from my perspective as a Woj lock newbie in terms of how this kind of fits into the pantheon of jiu-jitsu techniques. Because whenever a new variant of something old comes around, people will often ask, understandably, why do I need this, right? What is the thing that this does that my existing techniques don't do? And the way that I would explain it is, if you think about kind of what a classic straight ankle lock looks like, you're basically doing a guillotine on the person's Achilles, right? That's kind of the idea. And yes, there's different ways that you can apply different levels of breaking pressure, but the idea in the classic ankle lock is you're kind of guillotining the person by their Achilles on their foot, and you're probably wrapping your whole body around their leg, right? It's kind of an everything against one limb attack. And it's effective, but of course the traditional ankle lock gets criticized sometimes because it's hard to get the maximal amount of breaking pressure that you really need to finish someone who's good. There's a lot of ways to shut it down. Depending on the angle, it can be hard to get a lot of extension. And some people will just simply let the damage happen. A lot of people also believe that you can't really get hurt and that it's more of a pain submission. I don't buy into that. I think you can get hurt doing this, but a lot of people, for whatever reason, will just eat a classic straight ankle lock. So as of several years ago, there was kind of an evolution of variants of a classic straight ankle lock that were very effective, but they kind of solved for some of those problems. So you started to see a lot more belly down ankle locks, which is one of my favorite ways to finish. You started to see some interesting variants like the Cowterra ankle lock, right? Just some evolution there. But ultimately with a lot of those, you're still, in terms of your hand grip, you're still kind of guillotining the person's foot, right? The big difference between that and the Aoki lock, and we can lead into that in the Woj lock in a second, but you already talked about this, is that you're not really grabbing the person by the Achilles anymore and guillotining them. In fact, in a lot of cases, you're kind of letting their heel slip a bit, and you're really pinching kind of their toes into your armpit. And that kind of evolved this Aoki lock game, which is a very different way of applying pressure on the foot. And then, of course, now we have the Woj lock, which, like you said, is kind of a reverse Aoki lock. So instead of doing the foot lock on the same side, you pull the person's foot across to the other side of your body, kind of like you're playing 50-50 or something, and then you do the Aoki lock from there. Is that a fair explanation of how you would describe this and where this kind of fits in? Because that's how I've been thinking about it, but you would know this way better than me.
I think that's like a good way of looking at this technique and how it finds its way into the ankle lock meta. I think there's also a way that it fits into the entire leg locking meta that's really important, because the reverse Aoki itself is like hard to get to. Like if you just try to defend the reverse Aoki, it's impossible to get. But when you pair the reverse Aoki with the inside heel hook or the threat of an inside heel hook, because in 50-50 for years, everybody would just go for the inside heel hook, whether it was through an inside spin where you're spinning under your partner or just sitting where you're both seated on your butts and like kind of in a shootout. That was kind of like everyone would just fight for heel hooks, and everyone would go for the heel hook and then turn their foot away from their partner so that you couldn't get the heel hook anymore. People would spin, and it kind of was a thing for a while. What changed how the Woj lock or the reverse Aoki changes the game is it's the best way to get a reverse Aoki or a Woj lock is when defending the inside heel hook. So this is actually how I finished my first match at ADCC against Josh Hinger. I got him in a pretty tight Woj lock, and I did crack his foot a little bit, I think. And from there, he didn't want to get put there again, so he turned his foot the other way, which gave me the inside heel hook that I ended up finishing the match with. So the inside heel hook from 50-50, and even from saddle, if you do it from another position, the inside heel hook and the Woj lock work hand in hand. If they give you a reverse Aoki, then you go for the reverse Aoki. If they defend the reverse Aoki, you attack the heel hook, and vice versa.
Yeah, great explanation, buddy. And like I said earlier, you always want to ask, how do these things fit into the pantheon of existing techniques? And whenever you present something new, you always need to explain, why would you use this over the other options? I think you bring up a great point, right? A straight ankle is good, like a classic straight ankle is good if you have their foot in that guillotine position. But if you're going for a heel hook, a lot of the time their heel is going to be out and it's exposed. So what's the natural defense? Well, you hide your heel. Instead of letting the person flare your heel to the outside, you try to tuck your heel to the inside, which is a great opportunity to then go for the Woj lock. I think this also brings up a great illustration of how sometimes there are no techniques that are better or worse than others, but rather it all comes down to what's happening in the current meta. And I think the meta right now is ripe for a technique like the Woj lock and the Aoki lock, because in a meta that was so dominated by heel hooks and has now gotten to the point where people are getting very good at heel hook defense, there needs to be a follow-up move that applies after the person defends the heel hook. And I think, again, the Woj lock is a great illustration of how you could do that.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think that what's cool now is I kind of like I said, I didn't invent it. I kind of discovered it on my own, because another great setup for the Woj lock is when they're playing 50-50 and they come up on top and they put their foot flat on the mat and they like try to play on their on one knee. That's like another great setup. And that happens a ton in the gi because people don't want to give up sweeps. So, and I think I use the Woj lock in no gi because I do no gi now. But when I was doing gi, I think the Woj lock's even stronger in the gi because of friction. And so it's it fits into those two situations. It fits into gi really well, or any point situation, and it fits into no gi with the heel hooks really well. So it's cool because I kind of discovered it. My coach Jeff, he kind of did some similar stuff, and we kind of worked together on it a bit. And then now that it's in the world, people are sending me different grips and different setups. It's kind of taken on a life of its own at this point. I was just doing it from 50-50, and I was doing it because of heel hooks and when people didn't want to sweep. Now I'm seeing people who are finding it from inversions, people who are finding it off of saddle, people, different grips that people are using. So it's cool that it's becoming bigger than just me doing it from 50-50 to 3 guys in the training room who would give me that reaction. Now it's become a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an interesting point about the gi as well. The big issue with heel hooks, other than the rule set, right? But the big issue with heel hooks and no-gi is that they are kind of vulnerable to slippage, especially as a match goes on and people get more sweaty, right? This is something that other foot locks, like ankle locks, you don't really see the same kind of problem, because if you can lock onto the person under their Achilles, it's just going to be hard for them to free their foot by just slipping out. Whereas with a heel hook, there's a lot of ability to slip your heel out. And similarly with the Woj lock, I would presume that you have the same consideration, but in the gi, there's going to be more friction. Now, this does raise an interesting question. Legality. Is there a ruling or a current understanding of the legality of the Woj lock under IBJJF rules? When can people use it, and are there any times when they cannot?
So here's something that's pretty interesting. So ever since I did the Woj Lock the World DVD I filmed it right before, so it kind of worked out perfect too for like my personal brand. I filmed it for right before PGF, and then I went to PGF and I used a bunch of Aoki locks. But now people are sending me it, and they're sending me it when they're hitting it in competition. And originally, when I hit it at Brown Belt Gi Worlds. So at the very least, I knew that it was legal at Brown Belt in the Gi. Now, I know some people who are purple belts who have used it and gotten disqualified. I know some people who are purple belts in the same tournaments who are using it and not getting disqualified. So there's not yet, because we're kind of in an uncharted, like a new frontier of this like phase of, or this like kind of sector of leg locks. Sometimes it's legal, sometimes it's not. I wish there was a good answer, and hopefully at some point the IBJJF will give a good answer, but it's hard to say because it looks like a straight ankle lock, but some angles it looks more like an Estima lock, which means it's a toe hold, but sometimes it looks like a straight ankle lock with the heel exposed. So it's kind of in a weird spot right now. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that.
Got it. Makes sense. Well, you know what? You know that you've made it when the IBJJF has to accommodate and adjust their rules specifically because of you. So I hope that one day we can say that that's happened, that Chris Wojcik has forced the IBJJF's hand and they have a Wojcik rule specifically because of your footlock. That would be amazing.
I've given them a lot of money over the years, so that would definitely be my one little payback to them.
Well, you know, you do bring up a good point here about how sometimes it can look like an Estima lock. For those who don't know, the Estima lock is it's kind of a wild submission. I don't even know how you would really describe it, but basically it looks kind of like you're getting a figure four or a toe hold grip on the person's foot, often kind of from the front, but instead of really attacking their knee, you're basically doing an ankle lock right on the foot. It's a wild submission because it can be so damaging so quickly that you can sometimes pull that off without even really having proper control. It's a very effective flash tap, right? Sometimes it just appears, you take it, and even if you don't have control, you can get the submission. But you bring up a great point about the legality, right? If a move is considered a toe hold, or it visually looks like a toe hold, then the ref might call it as such, even if that wasn't the intent. I guess I would ask you, from the perspective of the Woj lock and the Aoki lock, what makes these so dangerous? Because people always tell me that these are far more impactful, powerful submissions than a straight ankle lock. What's the mechanic behind that makes it more damaging than just the classic, I'm going to guillotine you by the Achilles ankle lock?
Yeah, so with a traditional straight ankle lock, what you're doing is like if you take your foot and you just like point your foot like a ballerina, that's essentially what a straight ankle lock does, is it extends the foot too far, ideally. And so you made a point about how some people think an ankle lock is a pain compliance, and I did hear that as well when I first started jiu-jitsu, but I think I would say now that anyone who is still operating under that philosophy has not been put in a good straight ankle lock. So just kind of a point on the straight ankle lock. It's still a very good submission, but it is a little bit lower percentage than an Aoki lock or a reverse Aoki lock. And the reason being, when you take if you take your foot and you turn it outside, like you bend your knee slightly and point your toe, now your ankle is becoming even weaker. Like if you think about if you had to stand on just your pinky toe, that's essentially what's happening. Your knee is being rotated externally. So kind of like you're opening your hip, your foot is being pointed, and the foot is really weak when it's opened in either direction. It's pretty strong when you just straighten it. Like most people, especially people who are flexible, can like ballerina point quite well, but most people can't ballerina on either their big toe or their pinky toe, right? So we're putting a lot of pressure on the weak ligaments in the ankle. And then what really makes these leg locks devastating is the rotational pressure that you're doing when you're finishing them. And that's going to also impact the knee. So it's an ankle lock, but like I hit one at PGF and the guy's knee, went as well, which is scary stuff. But it's like that kind of just goes to show that this lock it's much more than just an ankle lock. It's both an ankle attack and it can attack the knee, similar to a heel hook. So these are like some people say, oh, it's basically a heel hook, and they're not wrong. It is like very similar pressure to a heel hook. A little bit more on the ankle. They like heel hooks tend to be more on the knee, but this one's on the ankle and the knee.
Now you bring up an amazing point, something we've talked about here on the podcast, which is that there are different mechanics for breaking a limb. Generally speaking, when you're going for a straight ankle lock, you're doing a linear break. You're effectively trying to take something and break it in a straight line. So arm bars and knee bars are often examples of moves that would classically be considered a linear break. However, there's this other class of submissions that are more rotational, right? So a Kimura, an Americana, a heel hook have that element of rotation, which often can be stronger in a lot of ways because you're working away from the person's strength. If I'm trying to do a linear break, often I'm working against strong muscles like your calf and your hamstring and your bicep, and that can make it hard to get a submission. So something that I often advise people to do is combine these mechanics. If you're doing a move that is a linear break, if you can add an element of rotation to it, it's going to make it more impactful. So a very obvious example, right? Back in the day when you and I started training, you were probably taught, as I was, that if you want to finish an arm bar on someone from the mount or side control, you have to kind of get 90 degrees to them. And basically you're at a perfect right angle and you've got their arm lined up with your spine. But that thinking has changed a lot. And now people will rotate the arm more. They will turn it to the side. They will try to put the arm in the pocket, right? It's no longer a direct linear submission, but they add an element of rotation, which makes it harder for the person to escape. And I think the absolute same logic applies to foot locks as well, especially straight ankle locks. If you are trying to do a classic straight ankle where you just extend backwards, your ability to break is limited. You're fighting against strong muscle groups. It can be hard to prevent them from defending. Whereas if you add a bit of rotation, like if you look at a lot of the modern ankle locks that work really well, they add a degree of rotation to it. So the belly down ankle lock, you're basically rotating your body around their leg. And in the case of the Woj lock, like you said, if you can add a bit of that pressure so that now the foot is being rotated, that's going to make it much stronger than if you just try to do a straight linear break. Would you agree with that assessment, or am I missing any details there that are relevant to this move?
I think in terms of the Woj lock, you kind of hit the nail on the head. One thing that I'd like to add, though, is one thing that is kind of becoming more popular now that it hasn't even really hit the mainstream yet. This is like the next kind of phase of ankle locks. And I covered this because Woj Lock the World, my instructional, it is about the Woj lock, but it's an ankle locking instructional. So it covers literally like 50 different ankle locks. And one of the variants that I teach and one variant of ankle lock that is going to become popular, I think in the next probably 3 years or so, is this like short Achilles, essentially, where you're locking your legs below your partner's knee line and attacking a straight foot lock, but you're locking below the knee line, putting pressure on like the tibia, the leg bones, the lower leg bone. I literally failed out of anatomy in school, but...
You mean basically like where the shin is, right?
Yes, the shin. But that's why I break legs, not repair them. But the locking below the shin and applying straight foot lock pressure can correct or give you the like oomph that is needed. Kind of like you used to see those videos of like people snapping baseball bats. Kind of like that. It can give you that extra pressure that is sometimes lacking in ankle lock. So the two kind of trends I think that we're going to see over the next few years is going to be these like Aoki locks and reverse Aoki locks or Woj locks becoming more popular. And then we're also going to see short Achilles becoming popular, both from outside Ashi and from 50-50.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of short moves like that. I find that especially with the legs, one of the big challenges that you often see with certain leg submissions is if you're doing a leg lock that is very dependent on having the right body length, it can be hard to make them work. Probably the most obvious example I would say is knee bars. I find it challenging to do a knee bar against someone who is much bigger or much smaller than me. They kind of have to be within the same size. And I would say that classic ankle locks have a similar problem, right? You need to, if you're doing a classic ankle lock, you need to be able to immobilize all three major joints in their leg and still get breaking pressure on their ankle. And that can be hard to do if your legs are too short. However, if you do that short ankle lock where you basically are fully focused on everything below the knee, and of course there's challenges to doing that, right? Because if you're not immobilizing all of the joints, it's going to be easier for people to get out. But if you can do that, if you can find a way to immobilize those joints and still get the tap, then that's going to work much better against larger opponents, I would presume.
Yeah, and then also too, kind of going off of what you just said, like kind of it's pros and cons, kind of like leg locks in general. There's a lot of pros and cons. And with the short Achilles, one of the major cons is if it doesn't work, you might end up in kind of a compromised position where you're either going to be losing the leg or you're going to be like getting passed and smashed. So there's a few different like cons to playing the short Achilles. The Woj lock is nice because it's pretty safe. Like if you don't get it, you're generally not going to lose 50-50. The con might be that you're a long way away from the next submission, which would be a heel hook, and you would probably need to go, invert the leg entirely on the other side. But like I said, there's always pros and cons to any leg lock because you are kind of attacking from like, I would say like a compromised position. Like a straight ankle lock, you're controlling the most of the leg, but it's generally one of the weaker like mechanics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Now, how would someone go about defending this Woj lock, right? Because where the Woj lock arises is the person has defended a heel hook most of the time, right? Like you said. So someone defends a heel hook, they are able to tuck their heel in so that it's no longer exposed. Then you as the Woj locker can kind of lift your hips or somehow get their heel onto the inside and then they're in a Woj lock. If someone gets into that position, how do you defend against it? Because having been caught in this before, I can endorse this move. It fucking sucks to get stuck in there. What do you do once that happens to keep yourself safe?
There is absolutely no defense. No, I'm just kidding. I actually, ever since I started using it at the gym, I found that like, some of the guys have started playing with it and a few of the guys that I'm training with have gotten really good at it, which is like super cool that like I just showed them how to do it. Like, I didn't even teach it. Like I wasn't even teaching at the gym yet. I was just like, we would sit around afterwards and some of the guys started playing with it and they got really good with it. And I got tapped with my own move a few times, like in the lead up to ADCC, which was humbling. But I've started to find some defenses that work. There's a few kind of stages to defending the Woj lock. So the early stage is going to be like before the heel is put onto the chest. And so before that happens, one thing that we can do is put our foot flat on the mat and turn the knee inside. So if you kind of come up on, because when this arises is generally going to be when they're attacking the heel. And so one thing that we can do to keep ourselves safe is putting the heel onto the floor so that it's difficult for them to get the heel off of the floor and onto our chest. The next thing that I would recommend, if you get put in like a fully locked Woj lock, a lot of people are going to try to belly down. And that is like the worst thing you can do. If you belly down when you're put in a fully locked Woj lock, you're going to break your own leg. So don't do that. Instead, what you want to do is relieve one thing that I think about when I'm doing the Woj lock is I get my hips under my partner's knee. So if I'm attacking 50-50, I want to make sure that my hip line is under the back of your knee. So one thing that I do when I'm defending is I try to misalign that knee and hip line alignment. So I try to get my partner's hips usually below the knee, like down more by the shin. That relieves a lot of the rotational pressure. And so I'll do this generally by bending my knee or straightening my leg, one of the two. Then kind of late stage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take both of my hands and I'm going to push my partner's ankles towards the ceiling. And that's going to make it very easy for me to now start to spin out and kick away.
Got it. And if people need a visual accompaniment, I presume this is a great opportunity to sell your instructional, right?
Yeah, I covered all of this in the instructional. Luckily, like a lot of it was like filmed right when the Woj lock was becoming popular. So it's pretty extensive. All of the new stuff that's happened pretty much with the Woj lock, like different grips or different setups, those are all in the instructional bar, like 2 or 3 that I've come up with recently. But this defense is in there as well. And defending regular Aoki locks. Another thing that I do is I try to think about, it's just coming to me now that I'm thinking about the instructional. Another thing that I do is generally, like I say heel on the chest, but specifically when you're doing an Aoki lock or a Woj lock, you want the heel to be like right on your nipple. So what I try to do if I get put there is I try to bring my heel even higher up towards my partner's collarbone. So when I do that, that puts it almost creates the sensation of too much heel exposure, which allows us to start to rotate our hips out. So that's just another way that you can defend it that is also in that instructional.
Got it. All sounds good to me, man. Well, something you talked about earlier there, in terms of what you're attacking, you mentioned that the Woj lock, it's primarily an ankle lock, but that there could be an element of attacking the knee as well. How do you find that lines up? Like, what could you do if you wanted to really emphasize damaging the knee versus if you wanted to de-emphasize, depending on the rule set that you're under? Do you have any control as the person doing the Woj lock as to whether you're also attacking the knee, or is that something that just it's going to happen no matter what?
So generally, because you're applying rotational pressure on the ankle, you're pretty much always going to be attacking the ankle first. In the few instances where people have felt it on the knee, it's generally because they have a pre-existing knee injury or like, they don't have great knees, but they'll generally feel both. I haven't really had too many experiences with the Wojcik where it's only the knee. Now, there are a lot of different finishes for the Wojcik. You can finish it belly down. You can finish it on your back. But the strongest finish, and this is the one where I get the most attack on the knee, is when you finish on your outside hip. So that would be the one that I would say is attacking the knee the most.
Got it. In terms of hand position, right? One of the things that is unique about a lot of these foot locks is that you're using a slightly modified hand position. So, there's many ways that you can do an ankle lock, right? But classically, when you're doing a straight ankle lock, you're probably using a grip similar to how you would use a guillotine, right? Whereas with the Wojcik, one of the things that I've noticed is you often use a grip that's kind of closer to a figure four. Can you maybe talk about what your hand placement is like? Because of course, when you're doing a move like this, if you're not guillotining them by the Achilles, you can't rely on that tension there to hold their foot in place. So what are you doing with your hands to prevent them from slipping their foot out and to keep it in position?
Yeah, so one thing that's cool is like when I did the Wojcik, started doing it, I swore by figure four grip. I did no other grips, and I would tell everyone that's the best grip. And now as it's like kind of being spread like literally around the world of jiu-jitsu, people are like showing me different grips that I couldn't have thought of that work for them. So there are like, if you had asked me a month ago, I would have said there's one way to do the Wojcik. It's this way. You do the figure four grip where you're grabbing your own wrist with your ankle locking hand. Like if I'm ankle locking your leg, I'm going to go left arm under and then grab my right wrist, and then right hand goes over the hand. So that's the traditional grip. But now I'm starting to see guys who are doing the like a reverse figure four. One guy who I trained with, Ethan Crownston, he's been playing with one that's like a really strong, a reverse figure four and then Aoki. So traditional elbow deep figure four tends to not work, but the reverse figure four is working pretty well, or a figure four on the wrist. Those are like the two main grips for the Wojcik. Right now, this is all changing so fast.
Got it. And what are really your objectives? Because of course, the thing about grips is that often when you're attacking something like the end of a lever, right? You're trying to do an arm or a leg submission. Often there is not one single grip that is best. There's a lot of factors that come into play. Probably most notably are the length and size of your own arms. That's going to affect which grip that you like. But in terms of helping people figure out the best grip for the Wojcik, what would you suggest that they look for? Like, what are you really trying to achieve with your hands? Obviously, you're trying to force them to keep their heel, kind of like you said, by your nipple. Obviously, you're trying to prevent them from being able to pull their leg free. But what other things are you looking for when it comes to how you find the right grip that works best for you?
I think that's a really important question. And also, too, that leads me into kind of one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they do this submission. Kind of the biggest mistake that people make with the Wojcik is they do not have their elbow close to their rib cage. So generally, I always tell people like retract your elbow. So your elbow and your ribs should be like I always say like T-Rex arms. Like if you imagine your elbows are stuck, or like a chicken dance kind of, your elbows are stuck together to your rib cage. There's no space. Generally, when people start doing these Aoki locks and reverse Aoki locks, they have a little bit of slack between their elbow and their rib cage, and that allows for rotation. So it doesn't really matter what you're doing with your hands, but your partner is allowed to, or is able to rotate their ankle. Another way that you can prevent that rotation is bringing your chest over the ankle. So I always say like drive your chest forward so it's almost over like the ankle joint, and then retract that elbow, and that makes it really difficult for your partner to move their foot. Like when I do it, there's almost no movement from the foot. My partner has to escape by rotating their entire body, which is when I can go into many of the different finishing variations. So the thing you're really thinking about is chest over the ankle and retracting your rib cage. From there, whatever grip is most comfortable that you can hold long enough to break the leg is what's important.
Got it. Yeah. One thing that I observed when practicing this move that was very different for me was how in tight that elbow needs to be. I mean, I'm very used to having my elbows in tight. I mean, God, how many times on this podcast have I talked about keeping your elbows in, keeping your limbs coiled? But even by my standards, I was kind of surprised at how in tight your elbow needs to be. Like you almost need to be lifting your own elbow up on top of your ribs sometimes, because the goal, like you said, is you're trying to get their heel onto your nipple. And so sometimes in order to do that, you need to kind of use your own elbow and the inside of your arm to dig their foot into that position and hold it there. Because like you said, if there's any space at all, they can either just pull their foot free or they can kind of slip their foot back into like a hide your heel position, kind of like you're going for a heel hook, but failing. So in order to do that, you need to really be mashing their heel towards that nipple. I think that's kind of the dominant thing I noticed that was really different about this move versus most of the ankle locks I've trained before.
Yeah, the heel position is extremely important. And unfortunately, it's like a detail that a lot of beginners will they'll try to get heel exposure, but you need to have, that's kind of like a lot of people will end up getting too much heel exposure because they're like, oh, it's an Aoki lock, so it has to be different. And I think too, if you look at some of like the highlight videos of Aoki locks, like in MMA, when Shinya Aoki was doing them, sometimes there is a crazy amount of heel exposure and people were tapping because they didn't know any better. Like there wasn't like a better, they were just scared that their leg was going to break, so they were tapping. So some of the highlights are like, they make it look more dramatic than it actually is.
Right. Now, in terms of body types, do you find that the Woj lock favors a certain type of grappler, right? And I know that for some moves, it's kind of hard to answer this. And I know that sometimes it's less about whether you're big and small and just everyone is so uniquely different that sometimes a move just speaks to people and they can make it work. But I'd be curious if you feel that this is a move that is more applicable for a certain body type or also against a certain body type, if there's a type of person that should use this or that you should use this against.
So in terms of body types, I haven't really found, one, I only have experience with my body type. So I've been told I have pretty big forearms. And so I think having big forearms makes you a better leg locker. Like my coach, Jeff, he has enormous forearms. And so I think forearm size is correlated. You look at Dean Lister. Dean Lister had enormous forearms, especially when he was competing. So forearm size, Kieran Kachuk, another guy with like big forearms. Forearm size, I think, weirdly correlates to having good leg locks because you can hold the ankle into place a little bit easier. There's less room for slippage. In terms of size, but also too, it's like, I think that is like kind of a small thing. And I think that most people can get pretty good with this. But if you got big forearms, you're probably going to have a great one. In terms of people who I wouldn't try to do this on, giants. Generally, I have a hard time getting reverse Aoki on. Like someone like Haisam. Haisam Rita. He's one of our guys. He's like 6'5", like 6'5", 240. It's not so much the 240 that's the problem. It's the 6'5". The legs are too long. It's really difficult to get the heel exposed. Because you think about it, you need the heel to be exposed across your chest, which means that you need the knee to be bent to a point where you can expose that heel across your chest. So if their leg is 4 foot tall or whatever, or like, however long someone who's 6'5's legs are, it's really hard to get enough bend so that you can put the heel in the right spot. So generally, like, I'll do one of those short Achilles locks on someone with longer legs, and then I'll do like a Woj lock or a reverse Aoki on someone who is a little bit, I would say, if you're like probably like 3 or 4 inches taller than me, 6'1", 6'2", I can still get it. But like once you start hitting 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", like really big guys, so like a 7-inch height difference, however tall you are as a listener, that is kind of when I might start to go for something else.
Got it. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but when you're doing the Woj lock, the way that you like to place your feet, much like with an Aoki lock, is you kind of like to butterfly, right? I think of with a lot of classic ankle locks, you're often wrapping your whole body around their leg. But correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that you often finish the Woj is by kind of going for butterfly hooks to prevent them from getting in close, right?
I actually just cross my feet.
Oh, you just cross your feet? From what position? Just like in a...
Just from 50-50. If they come on one knee. I generally don't like butterfly hooks anymore for Aoki locks because I found like a spin out defense anytime that they go butterfly hook. And it works like, I've had like a really high success rate. Like I'm so confident in it that like when I compete, I want to let someone put me in an Aoki so I can just spin out of it. And that's from butterfly. If they lock outside Ashi, my super secret spin escape doesn't work anymore. So generally I like to lock my legs, and that's the same with the Woj lock. I lock my legs around the knee and I try to get hips under the knee. And that gives me like kind of the strongest situation to entangle the legs. So, and also too, from there, it's really easy to transition to heel hooks and back and forth between the Aoki. Butterfly Ashi or butterfly 50-50 is good, but I find that it's a little bit easier to spin out of.
Yeah, this is why I asked, is when you were talking about not using this against bigger guys. The one thing that I find is if you want to butterfly someone. I find that really hard to do if my legs are a lot shorter than theirs because they can still get up and clear my butterfly hook relatively easily. So I have not had the best success with those. So I find that interesting. So you're kind of going for like a 50-50, you're crossing your legs, kind of like an outside ashy type thing, and you find that sufficient to just hold them in place?
Yep. Yeah. So and I'm not triangling. I think that's important. I don't triangle. I cross my feet. The other thing too, I kind of butterfly ashi, butterfly 50-50. Although I don't use it for finishing, I use it all the time for setting up. So I think that's really important to remember. I use the butterfly hooks because it's one of the best ways to expose the heel, but I generally don't do it if someone or I don't finish from there. And also too, like you were saying, I generally don't do it if they're like super tall. Like if they're super tall, I generally go either outside heel hook, inside heel hook, or I go short Achilles, straight ankle lock. The Aoki stuff can be tough when their leg is way, way longer than yours.
Got it. I like that point too about using the butterfly to elevate, right? Sometimes that's easier to do to get them off balance and to create openings than to try to finish from there. Because if there is a big enough difference, what I often find is using hooks like that as a frame, it's just not enough. You see this with a lot of guards where you're using your feet to track them. If there's enough of a leg length difference, it could be easy for a tall person to just clear you completely. Do you find that with the outside ashy, I guess, configuration where you kind of crossed your ankles on the outside of their hip, do you find any special considerations there regarding size or strength? Because that seems like that should work pretty well against big people, unless their leg is just so long that it just biologically it doesn't work because you just can't get your whole body lined up with their leg due to the length. It seems to me like that should otherwise work okay.
Yeah, I mean, generally I feel like the biggest obstacle to getting the reverse Aoki is length. Strength, size is not generally a problem. It's length. There are some guys who are tall and skinny, who weigh what I weigh, but they're like 6'5" or whatever. Those guys are generally harder to reverse Aoki than someone who is like 230, but 6'1" or something. Like I'm 5'10" for comparison. So like within 3 to 4 inches, generally not a problem in terms of height. Anything like 6'3", like Heisem, I think is 6'5", and it's just, I don't think I've ever done a reverse Aoki on him. And I've hit it on almost everybody in the gym at this point.
Awesome. That makes a ton of sense. So do you think that there's going to be, and maybe I'm asking you to predict something here that you simply can't do you think that there is any kind of configuration that could be used that in the future might work better against bigger people? Because I agree with a lot of leg locks. The big challenge that I find is body dimensions can sometimes just make them much less viable. Have you been experimenting with or practicing with anything that you think scales to solve those problems?
Yeah, so like I said a second ago, I think the short Achilles is great. However, the con to the short Achilles is you're doing it on someone who's bigger than you. And if it doesn't work, now you're putting yourself, and I said this earlier as well, the short Achilles kind of puts you in a compromised position. So if you do the short Achilles, you put yourself in a compromised position and it doesn't work, then you're in a bad position getting smashed by someone who's bigger than you. And that's really bad. So I generally like to I start usually working backside off of the short Achilles. So like backside 50-50, backside outside ashi, and then maybe passing to 50-50, but like generally trying to work around my partner to get myself some sort of leverage. And I'll do that off of like a failed short Achilles. So short Achilles first, and then off of the short Achilles, I'm going to go chase the back. And then actually another thing that works really well on the big guys is a Z-lock. So like if you can reap and lock your legs, that's the complete opposite of the short Achilles. But because of the Z-lock is not an ankle lock anymore, we're attacking the hips. And so it doesn't really matter how long their legs are. You can just kind of, as long as you can create bend in the knee, the Z-lock is a great option as well.
Yeah. That might be a bit beyond the scope of what we can explain through audio here. I feel like we could do a whole separate conversation on the Z-lock. It's funny, when I started jiu-jitsu, there was another move. I think Stephen Kesting did an instructional, what he called a Z-lock, but it was a completely different move. It was like some catch wrestling thing. And I got super confused when everyone started referring to this new leg lock as a Z-lock, because I thought we were talking about the same thing. But actually, I'm curious, is that a move that you use as well? Are you a Z-lock player? Is that something that you cover on your instructional?
So the instructional, I tried to make it as niche as possible. So it is only ankle locks. So I didn't cover Z-locks in the instructional, but I do play quite a bit of Z-locks, especially recently because I've been playing saddle. And I definitely recommend people check out Taylor Pierman's instructional. Taylor came to train with us before ADCC, and he was playing a lot of false reap stuff and using false reap to go either inside, he was calling it inside ashi, or eventually working to Z-lock. So definitely recommend people who are interested in learning about Z-locks, check that out. And also Jason Rao's got a video on Z-locks, and those guys are definitely better Z-lockers than I am. But I think that that's like a really good kind of lock if their leg is super extended, like wrapping around the leg. And I find that there is a place for it, especially like, I think the last episode I did, we talked a little bit about the false reap. Off the false reap, I play a lot of Z-lock, but generally other than that, not so much.
Now, maybe one other thing to just add here, if people want to kind of start out with this. So just for some background here, we did a camp recently back in December. We were down in Georgia for our annual camp, and we were doing some games around leg entanglements. And the one thing that came up with a lot of people was that if they get good enough at other areas of jiu-jitsu, but then try to add in leg locks later on, it can be really hard. And I think for a variety of reasons, that's just human psychology, right? If you're starting someone out and they're learning leg locks from day one, it's something they're always going to be comfortable with. But if someone is a purple or a brown or a black belt, when they start learning this stuff, it can be kind of hard to figure out, how do you introduce this into your game? I was talking to Rob Bernacki about this. He mentioned that in his opinion, because of how new leg locks are and because of how rapidly the development of these is exploding, it's very hard to give people the same kind of solid, conceptual, foundational, timeless framework that you could give to more classic jiu-jitsu. Well, one of the things that he mentioned was that, look, at the end of the day, if you want to be really good at leg locks, you have to study a lot and keep up to date because it's evolving so rapidly. Whereas traditional jiu-jitsu, I think a lot of it is solidified and there's some great frameworks on top of this. So if someone came to you and they said, look, I want to learn this stuff, but I'm kind of new to the whole leg lock game in general, where do you recommend that people start off with? Is it okay to kind of take the Woj lock on as a beginner technique, or do you have a way that you like to onboard people who are maybe newer to this kind of stuff?
So when I teach, generally, I do a lot of leg lock seminars. And when I teach a leg lock seminar, a lot of the room are people who are white, blue, purple belts who are generally, not competitors, and they're more training for fun. And some of them have done leg locks. Generally, I'll always have someone who comes to the room who's like got really good leg locks, and they're just kind of trying to refine. But most of the people that I teach when I teach a leg lock seminar are day one, leg lockers, or, they've done it a few times, but they're not advanced. They're not very experienced with it. The way that I teach leg locks to beginners is I generally start off with the straight ankle lock, because I think that is going to give you the foundation that you need. Because if you can break somebody with a straight ankle lock, or at least be dangerous with a straight ankle lock, then you have the key principles that are going to give you a dangerous straight ankle lock, like getting the foot pointed, getting the toes just past the armpit, getting your elbow to your rib cage, and then applying hip pressure into the leg. If you can do that on just a straight ankle lock, once you start understanding the mechanics in the context with an Aoki or a reverse Aoki or a short Achilles or any other leg lock, if you can get those key principles down, you're going to be able to transfer them to other leg locks. So I would generally say, watch good straight ankle lock technique. It doesn't have to, for me, my instructional has the straight ankle lock, and then it goes kind of in order. Like the first move I show is the straight ankle lock, and then we kind of build off of that, because I think that's to give you the foundation. But you need to know how to do a straight ankle lock well, and then you can start to do kind of all the fancy stuff. Because a lot of people will learn like kind of a crappy straight ankle lock, and then they'll go and try to do an Aoki lock, and their Aoki lock looks just wacky because they're not doing the ankle lock, and the Aoki lock and the straight ankle lock are not as different as people make them out to be. So if you can get good at the basic one, which is, kind of what every white belt should be learning anyway, then you can become kind of more competent, and well-rounded with the more advanced leg locks.
That's really interesting. I didn't expect you to say that. I kind of thought maybe you would say, the old straight ankle is dead. But I agree with you that although it's very simple, and although there are limitations around it, the ability to consistently get into a threatening classic ankle lock entanglement, like a classic ashigarami, even if you can't finish there, it's a great first entry point to that game. And what I have found personally, as someone who trains primarily in the gi, so I'm often not training with people who expect or want me to do a lot of fancy foot stuff, I find that even that skill set is invaluable, because if you can get into a classic standard Ashi, right, then from there, it's very easy to get into a lot of other things like single leg X guard or up into leg drags or to advance through the leg entanglement hierarchy. All of those options become available. So I think that that's good advice. That's a really good non-threatening way to get people into this system.
And then I think one kind of last thing is you need to be regularly training leg locks in order to learn leg locks, which sounds like dumb advice, but it's crazy to me how many people are like, oh, I want to learn leg locks. And then all they're doing is trying to just hit leg locks when they're rolling. When I was first learning leg locks, we would do one training day per week that was literally just leg lock rounds, like an hour of leg lock rounds. And if you do an hour of just rounds in a leg lock position, if you do that for 52 weeks, that's 52 hours of live leg lock training, which is way, like, I guess that doesn't sound like too much, but that is way more than anybody else is doing. So if you take 1 hour a week and you can kind of like pun your ego and just tap when you're in a leg lock, you're going to become so much more comfortable with it. And then from there, you're going to get really good at the offense.
I think there's some good advice there. And I know, like you said, it sounds obvious. Well, if you want to do a thing, you have to train the thing. But that actually proves kind of challenging for people to do in practice, especially if jiu-jitsu is kind of like a hobby for them. You know, you go into the gym, you go onto autopilot mode, you're just rolling. It's easy to fall back onto the things that you would always do as part of your A game. And that's why we talk so much on this podcast about things like deliberate practice and making sure that you're very focused with your training and you have a goal for why you're doing what you're doing. How do you structure those sessions? Because one of the things you brought up there is that you do specific leg lock training. What does leg lock day look like for Chris Wojcik? How do you structure that kind of training and what does your class look like?
Yeah, so it looks pretty different now because I think that I'm like one of the best leg lockers in professional jiu-jitsu right now. So I'm not doing leg lock rounds every single, I'm not doing 1 day a week where I'm doing only leg locking rounds. Instead, I'm doing some leg locks every day. And then generally 1 or 2 days a week, I'll do 1 10-minute leg lock round, either in 50-50 or in saddle or both or outside ashi. And I'll generally try to do it with one of the best leg lockers in the room. So I'll try to do it with, guys who are like maybe big guys. Cause like we talked about how I have a hard time leg locking big guys. So I'll try to do that and I'll try to challenge myself in that regard. And then when I'm training, I just naturally am going for leg locks a lot. For me, I'm at a point in my jiu-jitsu where I would be neglectful and almost selfish to only do leg lock rounds. Like I would just be giving myself a ton of positive feedback by only working on the thing I'm good at. However, when I first started, we would take 3 positions. So we would do our warm up. Generally, I would always try to do some live wrestling just because I think live wrestling is one of the most important things in jiu-jitsu and I was trying to compete. But you can even just skip that part and just do a warm up and then get straight into the leg lock training. And I would do 50-50 or outside ashi or saddle, and we would choose our saddle or cross ashi. We would do it with either one leg free or one leg or both legs controlled. So you either have almost like off of a false reap or a leg entry where the secondary leg is not yet controlled and you can just kind of scramble from there. And then we would do other rounds where the leg is controlled. We'd also do 50-50, and generally for 50-50, it would be like a 2 or 3 minute round. The other rounds would be a 2-minute round and you're switching offense and defense after the 2 minutes. We would do 3 rounds with 3 different partners. You can modify this however you see fit, but generally do like 2 minutes in each entanglement and then, either find another partner or just keep working with the same partner and you can extend the rounds. So it'd be 50-50. And then from outside ashi, we would also add variations from there. It would either be partner is on one knee, partner is sitting on their butt, partner is standing up. And those would be kind of the main variations. And same with 50-50. It would be either like shootout or like one partner is on top. So it'd be kind of ecological, I guess, because it's like there is objectives within it, but like it's more just leg lock rounds, with a lot of different variations.
Got it. Well, I will save the eco conversation for another day. I'd actually love to pick your brain on that at some point. But for now, Chris, man, as always, I love having you here. I love watching you do your thing out there and compete. It's been great seeing just the amazing year that you had in 2024. If people want to follow you or learn more from you or check out this instructional, of course, let's plug that stuff. How do people do that?
Yeah, so first of all, you can follow me on Instagram at Chris M. Wojcik. Chris Wojcik was taken, so I'm M. Wojcik for my middle name. I also run the Grappler's Diary, which is like a Instagram blog where I post like little jiu-jitsu advice every single day. And that is also a newsletter. And if you read the newsletter, you can also learn about who's on BJJ Mental Models for that week. And then I also just released my first book, which is under the Grappler's Diary umbrella. It's called A Grappler's Diary. It's available on Amazon, and it's just like 151 notes on jiu-jitsu advice. So if you like reading about jiu-jitsu and you want to check out my stuff, the book is probably the best thing. And Steve, I'll send you this link. And then lastly, if you want to learn about the stuff that we talked about today, go to BJJ Fanatics and type in Woj Lock the World. And that is my leg lock instructional. It covers every single ankle lock that I know, every single ankle lock that I've, like every technique in there, I've tapped a black belt with. I wouldn't put something in there if I hadn't tapped a black belt with it. And so everything I put in there works. It covers all the braking mechanics, all the like variations, all the different leg configurations, and just, kind of my ankle locking system. So it's only ankle locks, no heel hooks, no knee bars, just ankle locks, steamer locks, toe holds. Anything that attacks the ankle, you can find it in Woj Lock the World.
Nice. Amazing, man. Well, before we tie this up, I actually want to take a second to expand on the Grappler's Diary and talk about that. One of the things that I, as you probably know, am tremendously passionate about are alternate ways to learn jiu-jitsu beyond just this classic model of just buy the instructional, right? I think that there is so much value in spoken conversation like the one we're having now. But also, I think there's so much value in the written word for learning. And it feels like in a lot of ways, we've kind of gotten away from that. But your newsletter is one of my absolute favorites, right? It's one of the reasons why we sponsor it. Talk a little bit about the Grappler's Diary and what you do there and why people should subscribe.
Yeah, so the Grappler's Diary, it started off as just a newsletter about, I was writing on Medium, trying to get like freelance writing clients on Medium. And then I read an article that said everybody should have a newsletter. So I made a newsletter. And I used to always joke, like my Twitter bio for a long time was the diary of a grappler or the diary of a jiu-jitsu fighter or something. And then I was like, wait a second, that actually could be a name. And so I created this newsletter. And as I've been able to kind of, grow and as a grappler and as an athlete and kind of have all these experiences in jiu-jitsu, competing, traveling, all the training, all those things, I kind of just wrote it all down in the newsletter. So that's kind of how the Grappler's Diary started. And so essentially what I do with the Grappler's Diary is pretty much like 3 to 5 days a week, I put out a post on Instagram, and they're little, it could be something as like big, like today I did one about cults because I was feeling sassy and I was like making fun of jiu-jitsu gyms that like have crazy traditions. But sometimes it'll be a post about how you can get better at leg locks or how you can get better at jiu-jitsu faster or how you can make your jiu-jitsu prettier or whatever, different things like that. And then kind of just getting people to think about their training and be more conscious about it, because that's something that I really try to do. And it's a newsletter that goes out every Friday. And then I also have a paid tier that goes out every Monday and every other Sunday. So there are a total of 12 articles going out a month, something like that. And if people go to thegrapplersdiary.substack.com, they can learn more about me, my writing, my jiu-jitsu, all that stuff.
Nice. Amazing. Well, I will put links to all of that in the show notes. Like I said, I think the Grappler's Diary is just an awesome resource. The majority of what you do there is free, so I definitely recommend people sign up there. I am also a big fan of newsletters. I also, like you, ignored that advice for a long time because everyone told me you need to do a newsletter, and I kind of put it off. And I started doing it many years ago, and I'm so glad that I did. At this point, and people might not know this listening to the podcast, but the newsletter, the BJJ Mental Models newsletter, is far more popular than the podcast, and the podcast is pretty damn popular. So definitely recommend people consider written word as a way to get new ideas into their head when it comes to jiu-jitsu. Reading is good for you. The Grappler's Diary is awesome. So as I always do, Chris, I will put all of those links in the show notes. So if you want to follow Chris or pick up his instructional or subscribe to the Grappler's Diary, just hit up the show notes, go to info, notes, whatever, and I'll put those there for you one tap away. I'll also put a link to everything that we make. It's all at bjjmentalmodels.com. Tons and tons of content on there, and 99% of it is entirely free. We've got these episodes, we've got our mini concept episodes, and we've got our awesome newsletter. So please do subscribe to all of those if you haven't already. And if you want to kick it up to the next level with us, the way that we pay the bills is with BJJ Mental Models Premium. It's the world's largest library of jiu-jitsu audio courses. which is a very different tactic from what most people do. Again, our focus here is not so much on individual technical details. That's kind of handled by traditional instructionals. But what we do is we cover a lot of tactics, strategy, concepts, mindset, even philosophy, the kind of stuff that lends itself well to audio. So if you are a fan of Audible or Masterclass or any of those audio services, I definitely do recommend checking that out. There's also a ton of other reasons you'd want to sign up in terms of perks and freebies, and even, of course, our coaching and business tiers, but I will park that and talk about that in another episode. Links are in the show notes, but it's all at bjjmentalmodels.com. Chris, as always, man, thank you so much for coming by. I love your mind for jiu-jitsu, man. You remind me, I've said this about a few people, but you're very analytical in the way that you think. If I've got a question about jiu-jitsu that's really nuts and bolts oriented, you're one of the first people I go to ask that question. So thanks so much for coming by and lending your time here, as always.
Yeah, dude, of course. Thank you so much for having me. This is, like I said, this is my favorite jiu-jitsu podcast to do. Anytime you ask me to be on here, I get just as excited as I did the first time. So, always a great time to talk to you, Steve. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all your support over the years. Before we started, like I said, you've been supporting me since, the very beginning, ever since I first moved down to Texas. I remember we did our first podcast back then. So really grateful for your support over the years. Love the podcast and honored to be one of your sponsored athletes.
You got it, buddy. And as always, thanks to the listeners as well. Honored to have you here too. I know that people have a lot of commitments to their time, a lot of demands on their time. I know there's a lot of content that people could choose to consume, and it's not lost on me that people choose to spend their time here. So thank you so much to everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. See you then.